They had invited her because absence would have been unkind, and kindness was a virtue society admired most when it cost nothing. So she stood beneath the chandeliers of Ashcombe House, where light fractured through crystal like 1,000 watching eyes, and felt the weight of her own name spoken nowhere, yet everywhere. Miss Eliza Harrow stood still as a portrait hung too low, observing a room that pretended not to observe her back. Silk whispered around her, skirts brushing like conspirators. Laughter rose and fell in practiced intervals. The scent of beeswax, roses, and warm wine pressed against her senses, yet none of it softened the familiar chill along her spine. She wore dove gray, chosen for modesty, though modesty had never saved a woman once her reputation learned to bleed. Somewhere behind her, a woman murmured, "Poor thing," and another replied, "She should not have come." Eliza did not turn. She had learned that dignity, like breath, must sometimes be held. Only 3 months earlier, her presence had commanded easy smiles and open chairs. Tonight, the space beside her remained conspicuously empty, as though her solitude were contagious. Invitations had dwindled since the incident, never named, only alluded to, like a bruise beneath lace. A misunderstanding, she had insisted. A lie, society had concluded. And in that verdict, her future had been quietly rearranged. She fixed her gaze upon the long table gleaming beneath the chandeliers, where silver reflected faces twice over, doubling each expression, each intention. Servants moved with choreographed grace, their restraint a contrast to the invisible frenzy of judgment pulsing through the room. At the far end, a place had been set apart, wider, brighter, flanked by flowers cut that morning. Even before he arrived, the seat itself commanded reverence. The Duke of Ravensmere entered without announcement, as if sound itself dared not precede him. Conversations softened, then stilled, bowing before his presence. He was not young, nor old enough to invite pity. His authority rested not in beauty, though he possessed that too, but in an air of finality, as though he were accustomed to being obeyed by fate itself. Eliza had seen him only once before, from the back of a church, his profile etched in shadow and candle smoke. Tonight, he was unmistakable. She felt the room lean toward him, drawn by gravity more than admiration. Ladies inclined their heads. Gentlemen straightened spines and ambitions alike. The Duke acknowledged them with restrained courtesy, his expression calm, almost distant. When his gaze passed briefly over Eliza, she felt it like a change in weather, cool, assessing, gone before she could decide whether it had lingered at all. The first cut came quietly. As guests were ushered toward the table, a matron with pearls tight at her throat paused before Eliza, her smile sharpened by apology. "My dear," she said, lowering her voice just enough to wound, "we find ourselves quite full this evening. Perhaps you would be more comfortable standing." Comfortable. Eliza inclined her head in thanks, though the word echoed cruelly in her thoughts. Around them, eyes flickered, satisfied. She remained standing as the Duke was seated, his chair drawn back with ceremonial care. Wine was poured into crystal goblets, the liquid catching firelight like rubies. Eliza's attention fixed upon the servant's hands, trained to perfection, yet trembling now, just slightly, as they approached the Duke's place. A bottle emerged, older than the others, its seal dark, its label unfamiliar. Her breath faltered, memory stirred, an overheard conversation, a hurried silence, a warning dismissed too quickly. Her pulse quickened, not with fear for herself, but with something sharper, heavier. The Duke lifted his glass, listening to the host's praise wash over him like rain on stone. Eliza felt the room narrowing, the chatter dimming, the chandeliers blurring into halos. She took a step forward, then stopped, the weight of every watching eye anchoring her feet. In that suspended instant, Eliza felt the full arithmetic of society's mercy. A woman might be forgiven for ignorance, for illness, even for grief, but never for knowing too much or daring to care. She sensed how easily the room would turn upon her, how swiftly whispers would sharpen into certainties. They would say she sought attention, that disgrace had made her reckless, that she mistook her own small dramas for matters of consequence. The thought should have stilled her. Instead, she thought of her father's pride, strained into silence, of doors that no longer opened, letters that went unanswered, glances that slid away as though she carried contagion. She thought, too, of the Duke's solitude, visible to those who knew how to look, the way power isolates, how reverence builds walls thicker than scorn. If he fell tonight, he would fall alone, and none of these smiling faces would claim responsibility. The host raised his glass higher, the toast nearing its end. Eliza's breath came shallow, precise. Each inhale counted like steps toward a precipice. She could still retreat, let history continue unaltered. Yet the bottle's dark seal seemed to pulse in her vision, an accusation. Somewhere within her, fear yielded to resolve, and resolve hardened into action. Her fingers brushed the linen edge of the table. The crystal nearest her chimed faintly, betraying her presence at last. A few heads turned. The Duke's glass hovered, suspended between intention and consequence. Eliza stepped forward, her pulse loud as thunder in her ears, and in that final heartbeat before sound and judgment, she knew that whatever followed would bind her fate irrevocably to his. The moment broke like glass. Eliza's hand struck the goblet before the Duke's lips could reach it, and the wine arced outward in a dark, gleaming spill, staining linen and scattering light across the tablecloth like shattered rubies. A collective gasp surged through the hall, sharp and instinctive, as though the room itself had been struck. Crystal chimed, chairs scraped, and every gaze converged upon her with sudden, merciless clarity. "I beg your pardon," someone hissed, though it was not meant for her. Eliza leaned closer, her voice scarcely more than breath, shaped by urgency rather than fear. "Do not drink that," she whispered. The words pressed urgently into the narrow space between them. Her fingers trembled where they hovered near his sleeve, aware of the enormity of the trespass. She had crossed a line drawn not in ink, but in blood and tradition. For a heartbeat, the Duke did nothing. His glass remained poised, his expression unreadable, the muscle along his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The host sputtered in outrage. A lady nearby lifted her fan too late to hide her delight. Already, Eliza felt the verdict assembling itself, neat and cruel. She would be escorted out. She would be spoken of. She would be finished. Then the Duke set the glass down. The sound was soft, almost gentle, yet it fell upon the hall like a command. Silence deepened, stretching, expectant. He turned toward Eliza fully for the first time, his gaze steady, searching, and unflinchingly present. In it, she found not anger, but assessment, and something else, curiosity sharpened by restraint. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand. The contact was brief, unmistakable, and devastating. Skin met skin, ungloved, unpermitted. Murmurs erupted, hurried and horrified. The Duke's voice, when he spoke, carried effortlessly across the stunned room. "Stay," he said. 3 letters, weighted with authority, delivered without flourish. The effect was immediate. The host faltered, uncertain. Servants froze mid-motion. Eliza's breath caught painfully in her chest. He did not release her hand at once, as though he were anchoring her against the tide of scandal he had summoned. He rose then, guiding her a half-step closer to the table, claiming space when none had been offered. "The evening will proceed," he said calmly, his gaze lifting to encompass the room. "With adjustments." A servant hurried forward, eyes downcast, to replace the stained cloth. Another removed the discarded goblet, hand shaking despite years of training. The tainted bottle was taken away without comment, though Eliza noted how carefully it was handled, as though it carried weight beyond its glass. Whispers flared, speculating, accusing, marveling. Poison was not named, yet it hung between them, potent as perfume. Eliza felt herself trembling now, the aftermath of resolve settling into her bones. She expected the Duke to withdraw, to let decorum reclaim its ground. Instead, he gestured toward the empty chair beside him, the one conspicuously avoided moments earlier. "Sit," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. To refuse would be an act of defiance. To accept was an act of war. She chose neither, and yet both, lowering herself into the chair with measured grace, her spine straight, her chin lifted. Around them, the room recalibrated, forced to accommodate the impossible sight of Eliza Harrow seated at the Duke's side. Dinner resumed in fragments. Conversation crept back, thinner now, edged with unease. Eliza tasted nothing. Her senses attuned instead to the weight of proximity. The Duke did not look at her again, yet his presence was constant, protective without display. When a footman approached with a draught, the Duke accepted it first, sampling before passing it on. When a chill crept through the hall, he removed his cloak and laid it across Eliza's shoulders as though the gesture were inevitable. No one spoke against it. No one dared. By the time the final course was cleared, the narrative had already shifted. Eliza was no longer merely disgraced. She was dangerous. Her name traveled swiftly now, threaded with speculation. How had she known? What had she risked? For whom? The Duke rose before the final toast, signaling an end that felt premature, intentional. He offered his arm, not to a titled lady or favored cousin, but to Eliza. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. They moved through the hall together, the space parting reluctantly, like water forced aside by a passing ship. Outside, night pressed cool and damp against her flushed skin. A carriage waited, its lantern casting amber light upon the gravel. The Duke did not accompany her inside, but paused, his expression grave, intent. "You will return home," he said quietly. "You will say nothing of this evening." "And you?" Eliza asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A faint smile touched his mouth, not unkind, not reassuring. "I will listen," he replied. The carriage door closed. As it rolled away, Eliza glanced back once, seeing him still standing there, framed by lamplight and shadow. She did not know whether she had saved him or condemned herself. She knew only that the wine had not been the only thing spilled that night, and whatever poison had been meant for him was now loose among them all. Rain followed her home, not as a storm but as a quiet persistence, tapping the carriage roof like a patient reminder. Eliza sat rigidly, the Duke's cloak folded in her lap, its weight both comfort and accusation. Each turn of the wheels carried her farther from the ballroom's heat and closer to consequence. By morning, London would be awake with rumors shaped like certainty, and she would be their easiest proof. She did not sleep. Dawn arrived pale and undecided, seeping through curtains and settling upon the familiar furniture of her small sitting room. The cloak lay across a chair, dark and unmistakable, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. It did not belong here. Nor, she suspected, did she any longer. When the knock came, it was precise, unhurried, as though whoever stood beyond the door expected obedience from wood itself. The Duke entered without ceremony, rein still clinging to his coat, his presence altering the room's proportions. He declined tea, declined pleasantries, and took the chair opposite her, his posture formal yet intent. Silence stretched, not awkward but charged, a negotiation before terms were spoken. Eliza folded her hands to still their trembling and met his gaze. "You warned me," he said at last, voice low, measured. "I would know why." She had rehearsed a dozen explanations in the night, each one thinner than the last. None could survive the weight of his attention. "Because it was poisoned," she replied, choosing truth stripped of ornament. "Not enough to kill you swiftly. Enough to make you weak. Enough for accidents." His eyes darkened, not with surprise but with confirmation. "How did you know?" Eliza rose and crossed to the window, needing distance to breathe. "3 months ago," she began, "I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. 2 gentlemen, both welcome in respectable houses, spoke of debts and remedies. They spoke of you as one might speak of weather, an inconvenience to be endured or altered." She paused, the memory tightening her throat. "I was seen." The Duke said nothing, but she felt his attention sharpen. "They accused me of listening, of inventing danger to make myself interesting." Her mouth curved in a humorless smile. "When I refused to repeat their words as they wished, they repeated mine instead. By the time the truth might have mattered, my name no longer did. He stood then, closing the distance she had sought, though he did not touch her. You could have recanted, he said quietly. You could have saved yourself. I tried, she answered. Once. It cost me everything I had left. The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like applause misplaced. The Duke turned away, hands clasped behind him, the weight of implications settling across his shoulders. You understand, he said, that what you did last night invites scrutiny I cannot soften. I know, Eliza replied. That is why I wished you to listen, not to shield me. He faced her again, searching. You risked yourself for me. For the truth, she corrected, then faltered. And because no one else would. The admission hovered between them, fragile as breath. The Duke's composure shifted, a fracture running beneath its polish. How, he said, teaches one to doubt motives. Devotion is often purchased, loyalty rehearsed. His voice lowered. Yours was neither. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, worn at the edges. This was delivered at dawn, he said, offering it to her. The wine was altered before it reached my table. The hand was careful, familiar. Eliza read quickly, comprehension dawning like cold light. You know who it is. I suspect, he said, and suspicion, as you know, is a dangerous companion. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers with the poker until sparks leapt and settled, restless as his thoughts. There are men, he said, who mistake proximity for loyalty and silence for consent. The firelight caught the lines of his face, revealing strain beneath command. If I accuse without proof, I invite chaos. If I do nothing, I invite death. He turned back to her. I require allies who do not flinch. Eliza's answer came with quiet certainty. You require truth, she said, and truth has already cost me my safety. She gestured to the modest room, the narrow windows, the single servant waiting beyond the door. I live carefully now. I listen when others assume I cannot be harmed further. A pause. That is how I recognize the bottle. He considered her, measuring not her usefulness, but her endurance. You will be watched, he warned. Every step weighed, every word misinterpreted. I am accustomed to misinterpretation, Eliza replied. It is the watching that concerns me. She drew a breath. If you ask me to speak publicly, I cannot. If you ask me to lie, I will not. But if you ask me to remember, to observe, to endure a little longer, then I will. The Duke inclined his head, an acknowledgment rarely granted. Then we are aligned, he said. From his pocket he removed a simple seal, pressing it into her palm. If you are threatened, send word. No signature, no explanation. His fingers closed briefly over hers, the contact deliberate, grounding. This alliance, he added, will not be kind. Its weight settled like iron certainty, sealing a path neither of them could retreat from without surrendering honor, safety, and breath at last now. Their eyes met. The distance between them narrowed not by movement but by understanding. Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving the world rinsed and watchful. Eliza felt the turning within herself, the point beyond which retreat was impossible. If you proceed, she said softly, they will come for me again. The Duke did not deny it. Then you will not stand alone, he replied, and though his words were measured, the promise within them was not. In the quiet that followed, Eliza realized that the greatest danger had already passed, and the greatest cost was only just beginning. The second gathering was colder, though the chandeliers burned just as brightly, their light sharpened by expectation rather than celebration. Eliza entered Ashcombe House again not as an afterthought but as a question, her presence anticipated, weighed, and quietly feared. She felt it in the pauses, the stiffened backs, the smiles arranged too carefully. Somewhere within those walls, truth waited like a blade hidden in velvet, and tonight it would be drawn. Every step she took echoed with memory, scandal, and the fragile audacity of having survived, while eyes measured her worth against rumor, rank, and the Duke's unreadable silence. The Duke of Ravensmere stood before the assembly, unmoving, his composure commanding attention without request. He had summoned them under the guise of clarification, and they came obediently, hungry for spectacle. Eliza remained near the wall, prepared to vanish if asked, yet anchored by the memory of his hand closing over hers. The air vibrated with restraint, as if society itself sensed an approaching fracture. Whispers curled like smoke along cornices, carrying wages, judgments, and the unspoken question of whether power would shield compassion, or crush it publicly for daring to exist at all tonight before witnesses who would remember. When the Duke finally spoke, the room inclined toward him instinctively, drawn by authority earned through endurance rather than charm. He named betrayal without ornament, describing a threat delivered by familiar hands and hidden courtesies. Faces paled. A gentleman near the hearth shifted too quickly. Eliza watched, her heart steadying as the pattern revealed itself, ugly and precise. Each syllable struck like a measured blow, and with every pause the truth grew heavier, pressing against reputations built on silence, privilege, and the assumption that women who warned were merely seeking relevance, attention, or absolution they did not deserve publicly anymore. Murmurs swelled, indignant and afraid, until the Duke lifted one hand, stilling them with effortless control. He turned then, not to the accused, but to Eliza. The gesture alone unsettled the room. She felt every breath catch as his gaze held hers, open and unshielded, inviting judgment upon himself as much as her. In that suspended moment, he acknowledged what society refused to see, that courage carried no gender, and that dignity, once recognized, could not be politely ignored without exposing the cowardice of those who benefited from her isolation and quiet suffering before this assembled tribunal of peers tonight. "You warned me," he said clearly, echoing the private words now made irrevocable. "And you were right." The confession rippled outward, dismantling certainty. Eliza's instinct was to retreat, to dissolve before consequence claimed her again. Instead, he extended his hand, not in rescue, but in recognition, offering partnership where she expected erasure. Gasps fractured the air, some scandalized, some awed, all alert to the irrevocable shift unfolding between them, where authority bent deliberately toward a woman society had already judged, discarded, and quietly buried beneath convenient disbelief and rehearsed moral superiority for years without consequence until now tonight publicly declared. The Duke named the culprit without cruelty, only precision, stripping rank from treachery and leaving motive exposed. The guilty man faltered, undone not by accusation but by attention. Eliza felt the room tilt, power reassigning itself in subtle increments. What had begun as survival had become alignment, and alignment demanded cost. She understood then that justice was rarely gentle, and that choosing truth over safety required an appetite for loss, for doors closing, alliances dissolving, and futures rewritten without apology, sentiment, or guarantee of reward beyond self-respect carried quietly forward into uncertain mornings shaped by consequence and resolve alone. When the gathering dissolved, it did so uneasily, guests departing with lowered voices and sharpened curiosity. Eliza attempted to step away, instinct urging withdrawal before gratitude soured into scrutiny. The Duke intercepted her with a look that brooked no argument. "Stay," he said again, the word altered now by intention. He offered neither comfort nor promise, only presence, standing beside her as servants cleared evidence of the evening's civility, leaving behind the raw architecture of truth, exposed and echoing between marble floors, watchful walls, and two figures newly defined by courage, consequence, and a future unwilling to return them unchanged. They spoke little after, words unnecessary and dangerous in equal measure. The Duke's attention never wavered, shielding her not with secrecy but visibility. Eliza felt the irrevocable nature of the night settle into her bones, heavy yet clarifying. Whatever safety she once possessed had been exchanged for something fiercer. She glimpsed in his restraint a respect deeper than rescue, a willingness to be judged alongside her, to stand where consequences landed hardest, and to choose truth publicly despite the personal cost it would exact from privilege, comfort, and inherited immunity long assumed permanent and untouchable until challenged by one night. As they parted, the Duke paused, his voice lowered for her alone. "This will not end cleanly," he said, neither apologizing nor retreating. Eliza met his gaze, understanding settling with calm finality. "It never does," she replied, accepting the shape of what followed. Between them lingered something unspoken yet unmistakable, not romance softened by fantasy, but alliance forged under scrutiny, tempered by loss, and illuminated by a shared refusal to look away when truth demanded witnesses, consequences, and the courage to remain standing after the room had judged, shifted, and revealed its teeth without mercy or disguise that night forever. Eliza departed alone, yet not diminished, the echoes of the Duke's declaration following her into the dark. Behind her, society recalculated, already preparing new narratives. Ahead lay retaliation, vigilance, and choices sharpened by exposure. What neither of them yet knew was how deeply the poison had spread, or how far it would reach next. Somewhere beyond lamplight, alliances shifted, patience thinned, and enemies learned they had been seen, ensuring the next move would demand everything already risked, and more still, from both the woman who warned and the man who listened, stood, and spoke when silence would have been safer. Its aftermath unfolded quietly, as consequences often do, without ceremony or applause. Doors closed without explanation. Invitations faded into polite forgetfulness, and Eliza Harrow discovered that survival could feel remarkably like peace when it was chosen rather than begged for. She walked London's streets unrecognized, lighter without the constant burden of expectation, her steps measured but unbowed, carrying within her a hard-won certainty that truth, once spoken, could never be unheard, no matter how desperately society pretended otherwise. It altered her forever, sharpening her vision and tempering fear into resolve she would not surrender again. Not for anyone else ever. The Duke of Ravensmere paid his own price, though fewer noticed its shape. He withdrew from certain circles, allowed alliances to wither, and accepted the cold courtesy reserved for men who disrupt comfort without apology. Power remained, but it felt altered, no longer an inheritance but a responsibility sharpened by conscience. In choosing to stand beside Eliza, he had relinquished the illusion of distance, and with it the safety of being untouched by consequence. Nights grew quieter, lonelier, yet true, and he found in that solitude a clarity he had long been denied by admiration alone. He did not regret. The world did not soften. It merely adjusted, as worlds do, accommodating what they cannot undo. There were whispers still, sharpened now by caution, and eyes that followed Eliza longer than comfort allowed. She felt the vigilance settle into habit, yet she refused bitterness, choosing instead a deliberate grace that acknowledged risk without yielding joy. When she encountered the Duke, rarely and always by intention, their exchanges were measured, precise, heavy with understanding neither sought to disguise. Something unnamed existed between them, not owned, not promised, but fiercely protected by restraint, patience, and an unspoken agreement to endure whatever followed. That endurance was tested sooner than expected. A final inquiry was convened, discreet yet decisive, and the full extent of the plot surfaced, uglier and broader than either had feared. The poison had been only one instrument, part of a quieter campaign to weaken, isolate, and discredit before claiming advantage. Names emerged, protections crumbled, and reputations long polished by silence fractured under scrutiny they had never anticipated. Eliza was called to speak once more, and did so calmly, without flourish, her voice steady with a confidence earned through survival. She felt fear, but it no longer ruled her. Truth stood. The Duke watched her testify, not as savior or patron, but as witness, allowing her strength to stand unborrowed. When the proceedings ended, consequences followed with relentless precision. Some were ruined, others merely diminished, but the threat dissolved, exposed beyond repair. Relief arrived slowly, carrying with it unexpected grief for what had been lost along the way. Eliza mourned the woman she might have been without betrayal, and then let her go, choosing instead the woman she had become, steadier, braver, awake to the cost of silence. She did not look back again, even when memory tempted her. Freedom sufficed. Spring came quietly, altering the city's mood without announcement. Eliza found herself drawn not to society, but to spaces where beginnings were possible: gardens, libraries, mornings unclaimed by expectation. The Duke joined her there on occasion, never presuming, always asking. Their conversations deepened, shaped by respect rather than need. He spoke less of duty now, more of choice, and she recognized in him a man learning to live without armor. When his hand brushed hers, it was neither accident nor demand, but an offering she was free to refuse. She did not. The moment passed, gentle and real. Trust grew. They did not marry, not yet, and not as society expected. The Duke offered something rarer: choice. Eliza accepted, knowing what she claimed was not protection, but partnership. Together they navigated a world alert to their existence, cautious but no longer cruel. Gossip lost its teeth, dulled by repetition, and admiration replaced suspicion where courage proved durable. Still, danger lingered, not in shadows, but in memory, and Eliza understood that peace was not the absence of threat, but the presence of agency. She had it now, earned and intact, and she wielded it with care. Love, when it came, waited. The final reckoning arrived not with spectacle, but with quiet truth. One evening, as dusk settled over the gardens, the Duke spoke the 3 words he had uttered that first night. "Stay with me," he said, not as command, but request. Eliza heard in them not possession, but invitation, and felt the full arc of a journey resolve itself. She answered without haste, her voice steady. "I am," she replied, knowing the choice was daily, renewed with each dawn. The world beyond the garden remained imperfect, watchful, and real, but here stood 2 people unwilling to be diminished again. Together, they faced what followed. There was no promise of ease, only continuity. The poison had failed, but the lesson endured, that silence protects only those who abuse it. Eliza carried that knowledge forward, teaching it through action rather than speech. The Duke mirrored her restraint, choosing influence sparingly, ethically, and in ways that left room for others to stand. Their bond did not eclipse their identities, but strengthened them, allowing love to exist without erasure. In time, the story softened into legend, then into memory, yet its truth persisted wherever courage met consequence. Eliza smiled more often, freely, at last. And so it ended, not with triumph, but with choice. Eliza stood one morning beneath open sky, gloved hands folded, feeling the future stretch uncertain yet hers. The Duke waited nearby, present without claim, his regard steady, respectful, unchanged by possession. What they had endured had not broken them, but refined them, leaving behind illusion and fear. Somewhere beyond sight, those who had conspired watched and learned restraint, knowing now they would not go unseen. Eliza breathed deeply, tasting rain and promise, and stepped forward, not into safety, but into life chosen, awake and unashamed. The whispers faded, leaving truth.